Somewhere in the basement of a museum there is a drawer. Inside that drawer, resting in a tray lined with soft foam, kept at a steady cool temperature so that it will not crack, there is a small tablet of baked clay. It is not large. It would sit comfortably in the palm of your hand, and it would feel heavier than you expect, dense and smooth, cool to the touch. Across its surface, someone once pressed a series of small marks, little wedge-shaped strokes, pushed into the wet mud with the trimmed end of a reed, arranged in neat rows, and then the clay dried and hardened and waited. It has been waiting for more than 5,000 years. The hands that made those marks belong to a person who lived before almost everything you were ever taught to think of as ancient. Before the great pyramids of Egypt rose from the desert, before the philosophers of Greece, before Rome was even a village on 7 hills. This tablet is older than all of it, older by thousands of years. And here is the thing that I want you to sit with tonight, the quiet fact that should stop you in your tracks. We cannot fully read it, not because no one has tried, not because we lack the technology, or the intelligence, or the patience, but because the world that produced that tablet, the way those people organised reality, the systems of thought behind those little pressed marks, is so far away from us, so deeply removed from everything that came after, that our very best scholars, working with the most powerful tools ever built, are still standing at the edge of it, squinting into the dark. That is what tonight is about. The oldest writing on Earth, and the strange, humbling truth that a great deal of it remains untranslated, undeciphered, or fiercely argued over. Some of it may never be fully read. Not in our lifetimes. Perhaps not ever. And the deeper you go into it, the more you realise that the oldest writing does seem, in a very real and documentable way, to come from a world before us. Not before human beings, but before the version of human life we recognise. Before reading was common. Before writing was used for stories, or prayers, or laws. Before it was used to say anything at all in the way we mean when we say something. The oldest tablets are not poems, they are not myths. They are, for the most part, lists, counts of grain, tallies of sheep, records of who received how many jars of oil. And yet, folded into those humble accounts, and scattered through the archives around them, there are marks that resist us completely. Whole scripts studied for over a century that still have not given up their secrets. Now, before we go any further, I want to make you a small promise about how we're going to handle all of this, because this is a subject that attracts a great deal of noise. There are people who will tell you that the oldest tablets describe visitors from other worlds, or lost super civilizations, or gods who came down from the sky to engineer the human race. That framing is everywhere, and it is designed to be exciting, and it is not what the evidence shows. The truth is stranger and quieter, and I think far more beautiful. So all through tonight, we're going to be careful to separate what the tablets actually say from what people, ancient and modern, have wished them to say. Where something is genuinely uncertain, I will tell you it is uncertain. Where something is guesswork, I will call it guesswork. And where the ground is solid, we will stand on it together with confidence. We do not need to dress this up. The real story is astonishing enough on its own. If you are here to quiet your mind or to drift off to sleep, then you are exactly the person I make these for. So settle in. Let the strangeness of ancient clay carry you somewhere calm and far away. And while you are here, I would love it if you left a comment and told me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I read them, genuinely, and there is something about them that always gets to me. Someone in Melbourne just starting their morning, someone in London drifting toward midnight, someone in Sao Paulo in the warm middle of the afternoon. All of us, somehow, listening to the same quiet story about the same ancient clay, at completely different moments of the same shared day. Tell me your city and your hour. It is one of the better things about making this. And if you enjoy these slow walks through the deep past, you might subscribe, but only if you truly do, because this is a small channel, and every single person who joins it matters more than you know. So, the oldest writing on Earth. We are going to begin before the tablets even existed, back when the idea of writing was only just beginning to become an idea. We will walk into the clay archives of Uruk, one of the very first true cities. We will stand over a small carved plaque found near a place called Kish, an object that some researchers argue is the oldest written document ever discovered, though that claim, like nearly every claim in this field, turns out to be more tangled than it first appears. We will ask who could actually read these early texts, and what it cost to learn. We will watch, over centuries, as little pictures slowly stop looking like the things they show, and then we will spend real time with the scripts that have never surrendered. Proto-Elamite, the Indus signs, Linear A, real writing systems studied by serious scholars for lifetimes that remain genuinely unreadable to this day, not for lack of trying, but because the distance between us and whoever pressed those marks into wet clay is, in some deep and almost unbearable way, close to incomprehensible. Almost. Let us see how close we can get. Here is something worth holding in your mind before we go any deeper. When most people imagine the invention of writing, they picture a single moment. Someone sits down, takes up a tool, and decides to record language. A flash of genius. A person with the intention to preserve words for the future. That picture is almost entirely wrong. Writing did not begin as a way to capture language at all. It began as a way to keep track of things, and the gap between those two purposes is enormous. It matters more than almost anything else for understanding what we are really looking at when we look at the oldest marks human hands ever made. But first, we need to be careful about a line that archaeologists and linguists argue over constantly. The line between writing and what researchers call proto-writing. Because not every system of marks is writing in the full sense of the word, and the distinction is not just fussiness, it changes what we think we know. Writing, in the strict definition, is a system that can capture language. It encodes the actual sounds or words or grammar of what a speaker would say. You can read it aloud, and it comes out sounding like speech. The words on a page in front of you work this way. Eventually cuneiform works this way. So does the hieroglyphic writing of Egypt. But proto-writing is something else. It carries information through symbols without encoding the language directly. It can tell you quantities, categories, who owns what. But it does not follow the grammar of any spoken tongue. You can pull meaning out of it, but you cannot necessarily read it aloud as a sentence. It points at the world, rather than transcribing what someone would say about the world. And the reason this matters so much is that the earliest marks we have from ancient Mesopotamia sit right on that uncertain border. Some researchers call them writing, others call them proto-writing. Still others argue that the line itself is too rigid, that writing did not switch on all at once like a light, but grew slowly out of one thing into another over centuries, with no clean moment where it crossed over. There is a great deal of weight behind that last idea, and it is worth keeping in mind because some of what gets called the oldest writing in the world is, depending on how strict you want to be, not quite writing yet. So what do we actually have, and where does it come from? The story reaches back further than the tablets themselves. It reaches back to a technology that archaeologists undervalued for decades, precisely because it looked so ordinary. Small clay objects shaped by hand into simple forms. Little spheres, cones, cylinders, discs, some of them plain, some marked with tiny lines. We call them tokens, and they have been found across an enormous stretch of the ancient Near East, from Turkey down through Syria and into Iran, in layers that go back at least 9,000 years. That is long before the first cities, long before farming had fully taken hold. People were already using small clay objects to stand in for things. The leading explanation, developed over decades most thoroughly by the archaeologist Denise Schmant-Besserat, is that these tokens were an accounting technology. Each shape stood for a specific commodity or a specific quantity. A small sphere might mean one measure of grain. A cone might mean a jar of oil. A cylinder might stand for a single animal. When goods changed hands, when something was owed or delivered, you moved the tokens around to keep track. It was a physical, tactile system of memory. Not language, not story, just quantities of things, made portable and countable in clay. And for thousands of years, apparently, that was enough. Small communities, simple exchanges, all of it manageable by shifting little clay shapes on a table or keeping them in a pouch. And then something changed. Around the middle of what we call the 4th millennium before the Common Era, in the flat river country of southern Mesopotamia, settlements began to swell in a way that had no precedent anywhere on Earth. The city of Uruk, in what is now southern Iraq, grew into something genuinely new under the sun. By the late 4th millennium, roughly 5,400 years ago, Uruk may have held somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 people. That is not a village, that is not a cluster of farms, that is a city, with all the tangled complexity that cities bring into the world, and complexity is a serious problem for a simple system of tokens. When you're tracking hundreds of transactions across a large institution, when you have temples and storehouses and work gangs and harvests, all flowing through a central administration, you need something sturdier than loose clay shapes in a bag. You need records that cannot be quietly disputed, or accidentally scrambled or lost when somebody knocks over a table. And the solution that emerged feels, looking back, almost inevitable. Administrators began sealing their tokens inside hollow balls of clay, which we call bully. The tokens went inside, the ball was sealed shut, and then, here is the crucial step, marks were pressed into the outside of the ball to show what was sealed within, so you did not have to break it open to know what the record contained. The information moved to the surface, and once you have that, once you have a surface covered in marks that stand for quantities and goods, you are only one small step away from not needing the tokens at all, which is, it seems, exactly what happened. At some point, someone realized you could simply press the marks onto a flat piece of clay and leave the tokens out entirely. The three-dimensional record collapsed into a flat symbolic one. The marks that had been pressed onto the outside of a clay ball became, in effect, the very first tablets. And with that, without any single inventor, without any grand moment of decision, a person facing the oldest problem in the world, the problem of remembering too much, reached for wet clay and a reed, and pressed into it the seed of everything we now mean when we say the written word. To see what this looked like on the ground, we have to walk into one particular place at one particular time. Southern Mesopotamia, a little more than 5,000 years ago, the city of Uruk, known today by the name Waka. Near the heart of that city stood a dense cluster of monumental buildings that archaeologists call the Iana precinct. Thick walls of mud brick, courtyards, storerooms, raised platforms, altars, halls lined with columns. This was not a quiet temple in the way we picture temples now. It was all at once a religious centre, an administrative headquarters, and an economic engine. And this is where most of the world's oldest tablets come from. When excavators first began digging there, more than a century ago, they were not looking for paperwork. They wanted grand architecture, carved stone, statues, anything with obvious splendour. But as they dug down through the layers, they kept turning up small, flat objects of fired clay, often broken, often clustered together in what looked like ancient rubbish heaps. And slowly it dawned on them what they had found. Not a library of literature, an archive of administration, the oldest office records on Earth. If you could hold one of these early tablets in your hand, the first thing you would notice is how unlike a book it is. They are usually small, palm-sized rectangles or squares, sometimes slightly pillowed where the clay was pinched between someone's fingers. The surface is divided by lightly ruled lines into columns and rows, drawn with a straight edge, turning a patch of mud into something that looks unnervingly like a spreadsheet. And within those ruled boxes the signs are still, at this early stage, pictures. Or at least they began as pictures. You can make out a crude drawing of a head, a jar, a fish, a sheaf of grain, the body of an animal seen from the side. Many are stylized almost past recognition, but when you line them up against the clearer picture lists of later centuries, the connections start to surface. This shape is barley. That cluster is sheep. This one means a ration. That one means a worker. Alongside the little pictures, and often taking up most of the tablet, are numbers, and not one system of numbers, but several. The early scribes did not use a single universal set of numerals the way we do. They used several overlapping systems at once, each one tuned to a different kind of thing. One way of counting for discrete animals, another for measures of grain, another for volumes of beer or lengths of cloth, or the surface area of fields. This is part of what makes the oldest tablets feel so alien. A single mark, a small circle, or a run of strokes can mean wildly different amounts depending on what it sits beside. On one tablet it might mean 10 sheep. On another, the very same looking mark in a different counting system might mean 30 measures of barley. The scribes knew the code by heart. We're still reconstructing it, one counting system at a time, as if learning several separate languages of measurement all at once. And yet, once you read enough of these little slabs of clay, the patterns rise up quickly, because the content repeats, over and over, in slightly different arrangements. Grain rations handed out to groups of workers, lists of people, sometimes named, sometimes marked only by a title or a role, and the amount of barley or beer each one is owed. Inventories of the temple's animals. So many sheep, so many goats, so many cattle. Records of cloth from particular workshops, so many cloaks, so many tunics, perhaps for a ceremony, perhaps for trade. There are tablets where each column is a kind of good, and each row a person or a workshop. One column, the name or the job, the next, the number of days worked, the next, the grain owed as pay, the next, the beer, the last, a note about status, female workers, children, dependent labourers. All of it is astonishingly ordinary, and also, in its own quiet way, deeply intimate. The oldest writing we possess does not open with a king boasting, or a priest speculating about the heavens. It opens with an anonymous clerk noting that a certain person received 2 measures of barley and 1 jar of beer on a certain day, that a certain workshop delivered 12 finished garments, that a herd numbered 53 sheep at the last count. What makes these tablets extraordinary is not what they say. It is that they exist at all, that the machinery of a great city was written down in mud, and that the mud survived, baked hard by chance and by fire across more than 50 centuries. And it is important to say that this probably did not happen in only one place, through one clean invention. The conditions that produced writing at Uruk were not unique to Uruk. Similar accounting technologies show up in roughly the same layers at other sites across the region. Off to the east, in what is now southwestern Iran, a different system called proto-Elamite appeared at nearly the same moment, around 5,100 years ago, possibly even a little earlier. Whether these systems shared a common ancestor, whether one sparked the other through trade and contact, or whether complex accounting simply tends to produce similar answers whenever similar pressures are applied, is a question that is still genuinely open. What we can say with confidence is that this stretch of time, the late 4th millennium, was the age when the practice of pressing lasting marks onto a flat surface became something real and something that stayed. Before it, there are tokens, tally marks, symbols scratched into pots. After it, there are tablets, hundreds of them from Uruk alone, and scattered among those tablets, a smaller number of objects that push the threshold even further back, or that quietly break our clean categories for what writing even is. One of those objects was found near a place called Kish, and it may, depending on who you ask, be the oldest written document ever discovered. The object from Kish is one of those things that look simple until you begin to ask it hard questions. It was found not at Uruk but hundreds of kilometres to the northwest, near the ancient city of Kish in central Mesopotamia, and it came out of a grave. It is small, and it is made of stone, carved rather than pressed into soft clay. On one face there is a human figure, probably a ruler, standing with something like a staff or a weapon. And around and above that figure are a handful of tiny incised marks that are not pictures in any obvious way. To some eyes they look like very early cuneiform, to others they look like decorative scratches. That disagreement has never entirely gone away. The reason people care so much comes down to timing. The layer the plaque was found in is often dated to around 5,000 years ago, roughly the same horizon as the late Uruk tablets, and perhaps, depending on how you reconstruct the sequence, even a little earlier. If those little marks really are writing, if they stand for words or sounds and not merely for status, then the Kish plaque might represent an independent birth of script in the north, a second beginning, parallel to the one in the south. But that little word, if, is doing an enormous amount of work. And to understand why, you need to understand how archaeologists actually date something like this. They do not date writing by intuition. They rely on a set of tools that are powerful but far from perfect. The first tool is stratigraphy, where the object sits in the layered cake of soil and ruins. If a plaque is sealed beneath a floor that can be firmly dated by pottery styles, by other objects, by scientific methods, then you can argue that it must be older than that floor. But if it slipped down from a higher layer, if it was disturbed by later building, or looting, or a grave dug through older ground, then everything shifts. Every trench is a three-dimensional puzzle of cuts and fills and walls and pits. And in the case of Kish, the early excavations were carried out in an age when field methods were far less careful than they are today. Notes are incomplete. Some of the ground had clearly been disturbed, so even the simple question of where exactly the plaque was lying has been argued over for decades. The second tool is association. What else was found alongside it? Pottery is especially useful here because ceramic styles change quickly and they have been carefully charted across the whole region. If the objects buried with the plaque match a pottery style that, at dozens of other well-dated sites, belongs to a certain century, that gives you a strong clue. But if the surrounding objects are a mix, some older, some younger, then the picture grows muddy fast. And the third tool is paleography, the study of how the shapes of signs themselves change over time. Later cuneiform signs have known life histories. We can watch how a particular pattern of wedges in one century grew out of a more pictorial ancestor a few centuries earlier, and the direction of that change is usually predictable. Early signs tend to be more pictorial, more curved, made of more strokes. Later signs are compressed, angular, streamlined for speed. So when specialists look at the marks on the Kish plaque, they try to fit them into that family tree. Do they look like late versions of signs we already know, which would argue for a later date? Or do they look like plausible ancestors, forms that could have simplified into the signs we recognise? Different experts, looking at the same marks, reach different conclusions. Some see a possible match for a known sign, perhaps for king or for a piece of a name. Others see no stable match at all, and warn against forcing a resemblance onto marks that may not deserve it. And this is where the whole phrase, the oldest writing, begins to crack apart in your hands. Because Uruk is not the only place these early marks appear. While the Iana archives give us thousands of tablets, there are related finds at other sites, at Jemdet Nasa, at Shurupak, and across the border at Susa. Some of these use script clearly descended from the Uruk system. Others, like the proto-Elamite tablets, follow their own strange path. At the same time, far to the west in Egypt, small labels and tags bearing early hieroglyphs appear on grave goods, perhaps as early as 5,200 years ago. And in southeastern Europe, even older incised signs turn up on pottery from places tied to the Vinca culture and the site of Tartaria, though most specialists consider those to be symbolic marks rather than true writing. The more you look, the less it resembles a single invention, and the more it resembles a tangle of overlapping experiments spread across different river valleys, each solving similar problems, each reaching for its own set of symbols. Some of those experiments grew into scripts that lasted for thousands of years. Others simply stopped, leaving behind a handful of enigmatic objects and nothing more. And underneath all of this lies another, quieter problem. We have not actually studied everything we have already dug up. Over more than a century of excavation, archaeologists have recovered tens of thousands of early tablets and inscribed objects. The famous ones are photographed and pored over. But a great many of the rest, especially small fragments, or tablets with only a few signs, sit in the storerooms of museums in Baghdad and London and Berlin and Istanbul and Philadelphia, and in dozens of smaller collections. Some have never been published at all, known only from an old field inventory. Others exist only as a rough line drawing made 100 years ago, without a single modern photograph. A broken tablet with 3 faint signs might have been labelled an illegible fragment in the year 1910 and never looked at again. And today, with better imaging, that same piece might turn out to belong to a very early level, or to carry an unusual sign that would tighten the dating of an entire sequence. The honest truth is that the answer to some of our oldest questions may already exist sitting in a dusty drawer waiting for a new pair of eyes. Until those scattered pieces are brought into focus, the first will stay plural, a cloud of possibilities rather than a single bright point. And inside that cloud, another question is waiting. Even if we could pin these early signs down in time and place, who exactly was able to read them? Whoever they were, there were not many of them. By the time we can see them clearly in the city-states of southern Mesopotamia, they called the place where they learned their craft the tablet house. It was not a school in the way we picture one, with a broad curriculum and a rotation of subjects. It was a workshop of memory, a place where a small number of children, almost always boys, from families that had something worth administering were taken aside and drilled day after day into the strange new habit of turning speech and number into marks on clay. Their training did not begin with literature. It began with lists. An apprentice would sit with a lump of damp clay and a model tablet made by his teacher, and the first exercises were as simple as they get. Rows of vertical wedges, then horizontal ones, then diagonals. Over and over, until the hand learned the feel of the stylus and the eye learned what a correct sign looked like. Then came the basic numbers, the counting systems for grain, for animals, for jars of oil, each with its own series, and then came the sign lists, long standardised catalogues of professions, of place names, of kinds of livestock, of grains and fish and cloth and metals and containers. We actually have some of these school tablets, a little slab covered in the names of trees, in no particular order, just item after item. Another filled with personal names, another that moves from simple signs on one side to complicated compounds on the other, and in some of them you can see the teacher's neat compact writing on one line, and beneath it the student's clumsy imitation, the wedges pressed too deep or set at the wrong angle. This is what it meant to learn to read and write in the first cities, not absorbing a language you already spoke, but memorising a code that squeezed an entire economy and society into a finite set of marks. The tools of the trade were simple, but each one mattered. The main instrument was a stylus, usually a length of cut reed, its tip trimmed to a triangular edge. Pressed into soft clay at different angles and depths, it left the wedge-shaped impressions that give cuneiform its name. The clay itself was a technology too. It had to be clean, free of grit and stray bits of straw, worked to just the right dampness. Too wet, and the wedges would blur into one another. Too dry, and the stylus would tear the surface instead of shaping it. Once a tablet was written, it could be left in the sun to harden, or kept moist if it was only needed for a moment, or deliberately baked in a fire if it recorded something important, like a contract to make it last. A great many of the tablets that survive were baked by accident, hardened forever in the flames of a city that burned, and alongside the tablets sat the seals, small stone cylinders carved with an image that could be rolled across the wet surface of a tablet to leave a signature in miniature, a band of pictures and marks that tied a particular person or office to the record. Sealing is its own small window into who held power over the written word. To roll your seal across a tablet and bind your name to its contents, you did not necessarily have to read every sign. But you did have to trust that the scribe had captured the agreement faithfully, and in the earliest periods, the power to make the marks and the authority to validate them sat very close together, inside the same small circle of people. So what did those people actually do? At the beginning, scribes were, first and foremost, administrators and accountants. The oldest tablets are dominated by rations of barley, by gangs of workers, by deliveries of wool and fish, by tallies of livestock, by fields and their yields. Every line is someone's day of labour, someone's measure of grain, someone's obligation to a temple or a household. To keep a system like that running, you do not only need rulers and priests, you need a class of human beings who can translate the movement of goods and people into stable records, and then, at will, turn those records back into enforceable reality. When a worker complains that his barley never arrived, someone walks to the tablet room and checks the entry. When a storehouse keeper is suspected of skimming oil, someone audits the tallies. Over the centuries, the role widened. The same skills that let you count cattle would eventually let you copy hymns and legal codes and lists of omens and tables of mathematics. Reading and writing became not only practical tools, but marks of status, quiet doorways into priesthood and scholarship. But for a very long time, literacy stayed a narrow channel. In the later Mesopotamian cities, only a small fraction of the population could read and write fluently, and in the earliest periods it was almost certainly far fewer than that. The tablet house was not open to all. It was where the sons of officials and priests and estate managers, and perhaps a few unusually gifted dependents, were shaped into the living hinge between the spoken world and the written record. And this small, trained class effectively decided what was worth fixing in clay in the first place. They chose which transactions were recorded and which passed by unmarked. They set the format of contracts and the standard phrases of royal claims. They compiled the very sign lists that defined what proper writing looked like, which means that the oldest texts are not a clear window onto the whole society that made them. They're a carefully framed view, filtered through the habits and the needs of the few people who had both the skill and the institutional backing to make marks that would last. When we read an Uruk ration list, we're not hearing a chorus of ordinary voices. We're hearing the measured speech of a handful of specialists, speaking on behalf of the institutions that fed and employed them. Whole worlds of experience, of home and family and private belief, ran right alongside the tablet tradition without ever once entering it. And so, when we ask what the oldest writing can tell us about a world before us, we also have to ask a harder question. Whose world, exactly, made it onto the clay? And who, standing in the tablet house with a reed in hand, decided where the line between silence and writing would fall? If you go far enough back in the sequence of tablets, the marks do not look like wedges at all. On the very oldest pieces from Uruk, you can still see the ghost of drawing. A sheep is not yet an abstract sign. It is a little outline with 4 legs and the hint of a head. A jar looks like a jar. A fish looks like a fish. The scribe takes a pointed tool and scratches curves and loops into the clay, the way you might doodle in wet sand. It is tempting to imagine this as a gentle pictorial age, a time when people were almost sketching their accounts. But try to picture the reality of it, an administration at the height of its boom, fields under cultivation on a scale never seen before, flocks numbering in the thousands, workers streaming in and out of storehouses, drawing rations in measured amounts, every single transfer meant to be captured in clay. Now imagine being the person whose job it is to cut all those tiny sheep and fish and jars, one by one, into damp tablets, hour after hour, as the clay dries under your hand. As the work grows, the writing changes because the work demands it. Drawing little pictures with a sharp point is slow. It asks for fine control, and it carves grooves that are likely to crumble or blur as the clay dries. So as the sheer volume of writing grows, and as more and more people have to learn it in the tablet house, the system begins to favour whatever is fastest, most regular, and easiest on the material. And the reed stylus, pressed rather than dragged, solves several problems at once. Instead of pulling a line through the clay, the scribe simply presses the cut tip in. One quick motion leaves a triangular wedge, broad at one end and tapering to a point. Turn the stylus, press again, and you have a wedge at a new angle. Combine 2 or 3, and you can still suggest the old picture, but far more quickly. Over a few centuries, this preference hardens into a convention. Curving lines give way to combinations of straight, wedge-shaped strokes. You can watch it happen if you compare early and late versions of the same sign. The rounded head of a cow, which once clearly showed its horns and muzzle, collapses into a cluster of angular marks. The jar becomes a rectangle filled with wedges. The fish loses its outline and survives only as a characteristic pattern of strokes, and at the same time, the whole script quietly rotates. On the oldest tablets, the signs are usually written in columns, from top to bottom. But over a few more centuries, the standard shifts to horizontal lines running from left to right, and the signs themselves are turned on their sides to match. What used to be the top of a sign becomes its edge. To us, looking back, this seems like a radical change, almost a different script. To a scribe living through it, it was probably nothing more than a series of small adjustments, a slightly different way to hold the tablet, a more comfortable angle for the wrist, a format that made it easier to scan quickly down a crowded archive. Clay, it turns out, has its own logic, and that logic pushes writing toward wedges. Soft clay does not like long, thin grooves. They close up as the surface relaxes, or as the tablet flexes while it is handled. Wedge impressions, by contrast, do not cut the clay so much as compress it, pushing the material aside and leaving a durable, 3-dimensional shape. They catch the light better, so a line of text stays legible even in a dim room, and they can be made fast in a practiced rhythm. Press, lift, turn, press again. On top of these physical pressures rides the force of standardization. In the tablet house, teachers want their students to make signs that anyone can recognize at a glance, no matter whose hand wrote them. Pictorial variety becomes a liability. 2 scribes might draw a sheep very differently, but a fixed sequence of 3 wedges is much harder to misread. And so the sign lists begin to define not just which signs exist, but what a correct one is supposed to look like. But as the shapes settle, something far stranger and more important is happening underneath. The old pictures begin to come loose from the things they show. At first, a sign is tied tightly to one meaning. The sheep picture means a sheep. The barley sign means barley. But administrators are always pushing the system into new territory, into abstract categories, into names, into little grammatical words, and you simply cannot keep inventing a fresh picture for every one of them. So the scribes start reusing the signs they already have, in more flexible ways. The sign that once meant barley can be borrowed to write the word for ration, because barley is the standard ration, and then it can be borrowed again purely for the sound of that word, no matter what is actually being discussed. A picture that began as a thing becomes a sound. The sign takes on what linguists call a phonetic value. And here is where a word enters the story that explains a great deal of our difficulty. Polyvalence. It means that one single sign can have several possible readings. It might stand for a whole word, it might stand for a syllable, a cluster of sounds, or it might sit silently beside another sign as a kind of category label, a hint that the next word is the name of a god, or a city, or a profession. Which of those a sign means depends entirely on context, on the signs around it, on the type of text, on the habits of the particular scribal tradition. For the person learning to write, this is a gift. A finite set of signs, each carrying a bundle of possible values, can be combined to spell out thousands of words without inventing a new mark every time. But for someone trying to read those texts 5,000 years later, it is a nightmare. The later Mesopotamian scribes lived inside this system. They inherited long lists that told them, for each sign, its different uses and pronunciations. They could look at a tricky sign in an old hymn and know, from their training, that here it should be read as a word, there as a syllable, and somewhere else not read aloud at all. We do not have all of those aids. We reconstruct them from whatever survives, from scattered school tablets and chant survivals and late commentaries. For many common signs, we understand the system reasonably well, but for rare signs, and for the earliest transitional tablets, where the pictures are still fresh and the sounds not yet fully layered on, the ground grows soft beneath us. A single sign on one of those oldest tablets might be a picture of a thing, or an early word for that thing, or a first attempt to write a sound, or a bookkeeping shorthand we have simply never recognized. The ancient scribes could trace these layers back through a living chain of practice that stretched across centuries. To them, the earliest wedges were not alien marks from a lost world. They were just the old, slightly awkward handwriting of their own institutional ancestors. We stand much further away, and it is right there, in that twilight between picture and wedge, between thing and sound, that the very oldest tablets sit, waiting for us to decide which of their marks we dare to turn back into words. If you set the undeciphered puzzles aside for a moment, and look only at the earliest tablets we can read with some confidence, a pattern appears almost at once. They are not myths. They are not histories of the cosmos. They are paperwork. Take one of the classic types, the ration list. A typical tablet is divided into neat compartments by ruled lines. In each little box, you find a run of number signs, then a sign for a commodity, and then, very often, some mark identifying a person. So many measures of barley for the worker marked with the female sign. A smaller amount for a man tied to the sign for smith. Half rations for a dependent, full rations for an overseer. Sometimes the commodity shifts. Barley in one column, beer in another, oil in a third, and the format itself tells you what this is. These are not private notes. They are official allotments, handed out from a temple or palace storehouse to groups of labourers working on the canals, in the fields, on the great buildings. Writing, in its first secure appearance, is a tool for feeding and managing people at scale. Another common early type is the delivery note. Small, single-purpose tablets that record goods moving from one place to another. So many jars of beer received from a certain brewer. So many sheep passed to a certain herdsman. Often the verb is not written at all. It is simply implied by the layout, a heading, a total, a list of entries. The tablet itself may have travelled along with the goods, functioning as a receipt. Some of them still show the little hole where a cord once passed through, tying the record to the bundle it described. Then there are field records, where the main sign is not grain but land. Plots measured out in units of area, with numbers attached, followed by the names or titles of those responsible. A temple estate divided into smaller holdings, strips of watered ground assigned to gardeners and tenants. And there are inventories, whole storerooms reduced to sequences of entries, 10 copper sickles, 4 axes, 20 wool garments, 5 of linen. The tablets do not pause to describe any of it in loving detail. They care about kind and count, what exists in what quantity, under whose responsibility. Running underneath all of these is a surprisingly sophisticated treatment of number. The scribes of Uruk were not simply scratching tally marks. They switched between different counting systems depending on what they were counting. Grain in one set of units, animals in another, land in a third, all keyed to a different way of thinking about the thing, as a volume, as an area, as a run of separate heads. Some tablets are essentially tables of conversion, quiet training tools that show how one measure of grain relates to a measure of bread, or how a field size relates to its expected yield. and all of this matters for one deceptively simple reason. There are no stories in this oldest body of writing, or if there are, we have not recognized them yet. The first true narratives in Sumerian, the royal inscriptions and the hymns, do not appear until centuries later, in the middle of the 3rd millennium, by which point the script is mature and the language has settled. In the oldest administrative tablets, there is no narrative voice, no sequence of events unfolding in time, no characters acting out a plot. Even when a ruler's name appears, it is usually as the responsible party for a transfer, or the owner of a field, not the hero of a tale. That absence tells us something profound. It suggests that, at least at the very beginning, writing was not invented to preserve myths that already existed in the air. It was invented to solve an immediate practical problem, the problem of tracking too many things across too large a place. Only later did it spread sideways into lore, and boasting, and hymns, and laments, and epics. This does not mean that the people of Uruk had no stories. They almost certainly had a rich and living world of oral tradition, tales of the gods and the floods and the heroes, told and retold around hearths and in courtyards. But those stories left no mark in the surviving record until both the script and the institutions behind it had grown up together. What we have instead, baked into the clay, is the pulse of a civilization seen entirely through its ledgers. We can trace the flow of barley from field to storehouse to worker. We can watch herds swell and shrink with the seasons. We can read status out of the size of a ration and glimpse the shape of temples and estates in the way their resources moved. But the people themselves stay shadows. Thousands of tablets list a human being by nothing more than a single name, or a job, or a mark that separates man from woman, adult from child. We almost never see a family. We almost never hear anyone speak. No one in this earliest archive introduces themselves, or tells us what they believed, or what they feared, or what they loved. There is a quiet strangeness in that. The oldest coherent writing on Earth does not tell us who these people thought they were. It tells us only what they owed, what they were given, and what they moved. It preserves the architecture of their economy in exquisite detail, and leaves their inner lives almost entirely in the dark. We meet them not as voices, but as numbers, attached to signs. When people hear that we can read cuneiform, it sounds finished, as if some scholar in the 1800s cracked the code, closed the book, and now the ancient world lies open in clean translation. The reality is quieter and stranger. There are several different ways for writing to be unreadable, and they pile on top of one another. At the most basic level, some signs are simply unread. On the earliest tablets, we can match many of the signs to later, better understood values. But not all of them. Some marks appear only a handful of times, in a narrow context that never quite announces what they mean, and then vanish. We can guess, based on parallels. But a guess is not a reading. Then there is the problem of language. Even when the shapes of the signs are familiar, the language behind them may not be. The earliest tablets of southern Mesopotamia are usually assumed to be recording some early stage of Sumerian. But that is an inference, not a proof. The script is still heavily built from word signs. The clues to actual sounds are sparse. The little grammatical markers that would confirm a language are often missing or ambiguous. In some regions and periods, we are not even certain which language a body of text belongs to. You can have signs, sitting inside a language you do not. A third layer is context. Imagine finding a modern spreadsheet with only the numbers and a few column headings. No file name, no explanation, no knowledge of the company that made it. You could read every character, understand every word, and still not truly know what the document was for. A great many early tablets are exactly like that. We can see that one sign is barley, that another is a personal name, that a group of wedges is a measure of capacity. But what is the setting? A temple, a private estate, a palace office? Is this a routine monthly ration, or a one-time emergency handout, or a list of fines, or a festival budget? The text can be technically legible, and still, without the missing social world around it, remain only half understood. And then, on top of all of that, there is simple damage. Clay is durable, but it is not immortal. Tablets were broken in antiquity, crushed in collapses, reused as rubble in later walls, eaten away by salt and moisture. Many survive only as fragments, a corner of a larger text, a few signs at the start of a line, torn away from everything that once surrounded them. On others, the wedges are still there, but the edges have crumbled, and a tiny change in an angle can turn one sign into another. In the earliest periods, when the scribes were still experimenting, different signs can look almost identical. A single uncertain stroke can flip a reading from field to city, from sheep to goat, from a personal name to a title. Every broken edge, every smoothed wedge, turns a potential sentence back into a puzzle. And all of this would be hard enough if we had only a few dozen documents. But we do not. The scale is overwhelming. Since serious excavation began in Mesopotamia, archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of thousands of clay tablets and fragments. It is likely that well over 500,000 cuneiform objects sit in collections and storerooms around the world. Many have never been published. Some are known only by a catalogue number and a one-line description. Administrative text, 3rd millennium. Even among the published ones, large portions exist only as old hand drawings, not modern photographs. And for a great many there is no translation at all, only a transcription of the signs into Latin letters, waiting for someone to find the time to interpret them. The backlog is immense. Each tablet is patient, painstaking work, identifying the signs, rebuilding the broken lines, comparing the phrasing against parallel texts, checking the names against known lists, weighing one possible translation against another. Multiply that by tens of thousands of nearly identical ration lists and loan documents and court records, and you begin to see the problem. Scholars, understandably, tend to focus on texts that promise something new, a royal inscription, a literary work, a rare letter. The routine administrative material, the very backbone of the archive, often falls to the bottom of the pile, and yet it is precisely in that routine material that the oldest habits of writing hide. Complicating everything further are the limits of the methods we rely on. When a script is new to us, our most powerful tool is a bilingual text, the same message written in two systems, one of which we already know. The famous Rosetta Stone did exactly this for Egyptian hieroglyphs, but for the very oldest scripts, and for the undeciphered ones, no such key has been found. There is no ancient tablet that says, in effect, here is what I'm telling you, and here it is again in a language you understand. We also lean heavily on long texts and repeated formulas, the standard titles of kings, the recurring clauses of legal documents, the repeated phrases of hymns. Once you know that a certain bundle of signs means King of Kish, you can find it elsewhere and build outward. But the earliest administrative tablets are short and formulaic in a way that does not help. A heading, a few entries, a total. No narrative, often not even a date. For several of the oldest writing systems on Earth, we lack almost every advantage that made the great decipherments possible. No bilingual, few long continuous texts, limited context, damaged objects, enormous backlogs. What we have instead is a slow accumulation of tiny gains, a single sign whose meaning becomes a little more likely because of a new parallel, a cluster of tablets that begins to clarify one official's title, a better photograph that reveals one extra wedge. Thousands of clay voices remain at the very edge of hearing, not silent, but not yet clear. And if you are still with me here, drifting somewhere in the dark, that is a good place to pause and simply notice how much of the past is like this, present and just out of reach. If this quiet is doing its work, you might tap the like button before you drift off. Not for me, but because it helps these slow stories find other people lying awake in other cities, looking for exactly this. And now let us go and stand in front of the most stubborn silence of them all. Proto-Elamite sits just to the east of the better-known Mesopotamian story. While the cities of the southern plain were rising in what is now Iraq, another urban world was taking shape on the Iranian plateau. At Susa, in the southwest of modern Iran, and at a scattering of highland sites reaching toward the region of Fars and beyond, people were building temples on platforms, storing grain in great jars, and managing herds and workforces that had to be counted and rationed and controlled. And sometime around 5,100 years ago, in this setting, a new way of pressing marks into clay appeared. We call it proto-Elamite. Most of the tablets come from Susa, from levels that line up roughly with the very end of the Uruk expansion. A few hundred more have turned up deeper in the plateau at places like Tepe-Sialk near Kashan and Tali Malian in Fars, and smaller settlements scattered across what would one day become Elamite country. And then, after only a few centuries, it stops. There is no long, smooth lineage, no clear evolution into a later script. Just a burst of tablets, and then silence. On the surface, what those tablets are doing looks familiar. They are overwhelmingly administrative. Lists of commodities, tallies of labour, accounts of animals, allocations of grain and oil and beer. Many are dominated by numbers, long columns of wedges recording capacities and weights and head counts. And just like late Uruk writing, proto-Elamite uses several different numerical systems at once. One set of signs for counting discrete objects, another for volumes of liquid, another for measures of grain. You can watch the scribes switching between them. Certain clusters of signs recur often enough and in stable enough positions that they almost certainly stand for institutional roles or standard goods. A particular combination at the start of a line, followed by numbers and then commodity signs, looks very much like the title of an office. Other clusters show up right before animal signs, in a way that suggests they mark out subtypes of a herd, or age classes, or perhaps places. At Susa, groups of tablets can sometimes be sorted by these recurring headings, hinting at departments or households inside some larger administrative machine. So at this level, proto-Elamite is not opaque. We can see that it is counting. We can tell when something is being measured, when something is being transferred, when a total is being struck. Careful comparison with the Uruk tablets has even tied a number of proto-Elamite number signs to specific quantities. In some cases we can say, with reasonable confidence, this is a jar of grain, this is a sheep, this line records a delivery, and yet the crucial layer beneath all of that stays stubbornly out of reach. We do not know what language, or languages, lie behind proto-Elamite. It is tempting to assume it writes an early form of Elamite, the language that is well attested much later at Susa and in the highlands. Tempting, but far from secure. The gap in time is more than 1,000 years. The script itself seems to vanish, and then reappear, if at all, only centuries later in a modified form. And the structure of the texts gives us almost no grammar to work with, hardly any obvious little words, no clear endings we could line up against later Elamite. We also do not have stable sounds for most of the signs. In the Mesopotamian system, a number of signs can eventually be tied to Sumerian words. You can watch a picture of a head turn into a sign that writes the word for head, and, by extension, the sound of that word. That bridge, from picture to word to sound, gives you leverage. In proto-Elamite, the bridges are shaky. Some signs probably began as pictures, but they had already grown quite abstract by the time we find them, and their later descendants, if there are any, are argued over. Without a known language to anchor them, almost every attempt to assign a sound risks becoming circular, and this leads to a deeper and more unsettling question. Is proto-Elamite even trying to record spoken language in the way that later scripts do? It clearly captures quantities and categories. It probably captures personal names and titles, since certain sign sequences sit exactly where you would expect names to sit. But whether it possesses a full set of signs capable of writing, open-ended speech has never actually been demonstrated. Some specialists think it may be a number-heavy notation, powerful for accounting but limited in its ability to capture grammar. Others believe the sound writing is there, just faint, buried in conventions we have not yet learned to see. Over the past few decades, an enormous amount of careful work has gathered around this small disagreement. Proto-Elamite tablets began to be systematically copied and published in the 20th century, but the real acceleration came with digital tools, high-resolution photography, three-dimensional scanning, and a technique called reflectance transformation imaging, which lets a scholar relight a tablet from any angle on a screen and check the exact shape of every wedge. Projects at the Louvre in Tehran and at universities around the world have built online sign lists and databases, each sign given an index number, each tablet broken down occurrence by occurrence. This has produced remarkably detailed maps of the system. We can see which signs cluster together and which almost never do. We can pick out regional flavours of the script, the repertoire at Susa differing slightly from the Highland sites. And algorithms borrowed from computational linguistics have been thrown at the patterns, testing whether the distribution of signs looks more like a language or more like a constrained code. The answers are suggestive but not decisive. Some features do resemble written language. The frequencies of the signs follow curves reminiscent of known scripts, and there are positions in the line where name-like sequences tend to appear. but other features look more like a specialised notation. Long stretches dominated by numbers and commodities, with very few elements that could plausibly be grammar. The system seems to straddle a boundary, more abstract than a pure tally, not yet transparently a script for recording speech, and what makes it especially frustrating is that we have no external anchors at all. No bilingual has ever turned up, no proto-Elamite tablet with a parallel in a script we can read, no later royal text that clearly reuses the old signs. There is no Rosetta Stone for this writing, and no Behistun inscription. The corpus, though substantial, is still modest. A few thousand tablets, many of them broken, most of them extremely repetitive. There are patterns everywhere, but not enough variety to pin those patterns to definite meanings. So the best supported readings remain probabilities. This sign cluster almost certainly marks an official. This number is probably a measure of capacity. That heading is very likely a herd, or a work group. Scholars publish these carefully, hedged with caveats and alternatives. And so the overall picture of a late 4th millennium bureaucracy managing food and labour and livestock on the Iranian plateau grows steadily clearer, while the exact words that bureaucracy used to talk about itself stay just beyond hearing. There is no conspiracy in this, no translation being hidden from public view. Just a set of hard limits, a script that died young, leaving behind no hymns and no royal boast to cross-check, a language that may or may not connect to any we can read, and a body of texts whose very efficiency, all those tidy columns of numbers, strips away the redundancy that helps us break codes. We can watch its scribes at work, follow their columns rising and falling, trace the flow of sheep and grain through institutions we can only label with neutral names. Office A, Household B. But the voices behind the accounts, the sounds those people made, stay silent. To feel how wide that gap can grow, even when the tablets are sitting right in front of us, we can travel far to the east, to another silence, older in some ways and even more complete. Along the valley of the Indus and its tributaries, from roughly 4,500 years ago, a civilization we now call Harappan, or simply the Indus, built something that still feels slightly unreal. Cities laid out on grids, with baked brick houses aligned to the compass. Drains and sewers so sophisticated they would not be matched in many places for thousands of years. Standardized weights and measures used across an area stretching from the coast of the Arabian Sea to the plains of the Punjab and into what is now Afghanistan. And threaded through this world, on tiny objects you could close your hand around, there are signs. Most of them appear on seals, small squares of carved stone, usually only 2 or 3 centimetres across. On each one, a short line of symbols, and above or beside them, a beautifully carved animal. A unicorn-like creature with a single curved horn, a humped bull, an elephant, a rhinoceros, a tiger. Sometimes there is a ritual object beside the animal, something like a trough or a stand. The carving is precise, and the imagery is remarkably consistent from city to city across a vast territory. These seals were not just decorations. Pressed into clay, they left impressions that sealed bundles and jars and doors. The same script travels on little copper tablets, on pottery, on stone weights, on tools and ornaments. It moves with trade, with administration, with the rituals of daily life. But every single time we hope it will say more, it stops. Because the overwhelming majority of Indus inscriptions are painfully short. 5 signs, 6 signs, sometimes 10. A rare few stretch to 20 or more. There are no long tablets, no walls covered in carving, nothing like the king lists and the law codes of Mesopotamia. The texts are like the names on doorbells, or the labels on jars, tokens of identity and authority. They give us patterns, but almost no continuous speech. And that brevity is the very heart of the problem. With proto-Elamite, we are held back by the endless repetitive numbers. With the Indus script, we are held back by sheer shortness. Short sequences mean fewer contexts. Fewer contexts mean fewer chances to watch a sign shift its role, to catch it behaving now like a word, now like a sound, now like a grammatical ending. And without those shifts, it is very hard to tell how much of the system is soundwriting and how much is pure symbol. Still, there are hints of structure. The frequencies of the signs follow distributions broadly like those of known writing systems. Certain symbols tend to appear at the beginning of a sequence, others at the end, which suggests something like a name followed by a title, or a title followed by a number. Some signs recur across the entire Indus world with strikingly stable shapes, while others are rare or local, exactly what you might expect from a standardized script with regional variants. Computational studies have argued that the arrangement of the signs is not random, and not merely decorative, but governed by rules that look consistent with a real language, and yet even that conclusion is disputed. One camp of researchers treats the Indus signs as a true script, probably capable of recording a real spoken language, and argues mostly about which language it might be. The Dravidian family, whose living members include Tamil and Telugu, is a leading candidate with deep roots in South Asia. Others have proposed early Indo-Aryan, or the Munda languages, or a lost family with no surviving descendants at all. Each proposal can line up a handful of signs with a few hypothetical words. None has produced a decipherment that others accept. Another camp doubts the system ever became full writing at all. On this reading, the signs are a complex web of emblems, clan marks and numbers, used to show ownership and status and ritual belonging, but never to spell out sentences. They point to the extreme shortness of the texts, and their heavy use on seals rather than on documents as evidence. Critics of that view answer that we may simply be missing the long texts, that they were written on wood, or palm leaf, or cloth, and have long since rotted away in the damp soil. What almost everyone agrees on is how little we can safely say aloud. We know the Indus script was standardized across a huge area, and used for centuries. We know it was tied to an urban network of astonishing craft and trade and organization. We can map which signs travel with which animals, on which kinds of objects. But when we try to read these sequences, to give them stable sounds and meanings, the ground drops away beneath us. There is no bilingual linking the signs to a known script. There is no later tradition that clearly preserves Harappan names or myths we could work backward from. And when the great cities faded, a little under 4,000 years ago, the script faded with them. The later writing systems of the subcontinent show no simple descent from it. So we are left with a peculiar kind of silence. We stand inside the ghost of a civilization that laid out its streets with mathematical care, that measured its weights to fine tolerances, that moved goods across thousands of kilometres, and we hold in our hands its seals. We can feel the wear on their edges, the polish of 1,000 handlings, the crisp carved lines of its signs. We know they mattered. We simply do not know what most of them say, or even whether they were ever meant to capture language in the way we expect writing to do. Now move the map west, across Iran, past Mesopotamia, over the sea, to an island. By around 4,000 years ago, on the island of Crete, another experiment in writing and storage was taking shape. We call the people who built it Minoan, after the legendary king Minos, though that name is a modern label. The people who raised the great complexes at Knossos, and Phaistos, and Malea, and Kato-Zakros did not leave us a clear name for themselves, but they did leave writing. For roughly 3.5 centuries, the palace centres of Crete kept archives of clay tablets and sealed nodules. Their storerooms were lined with enormous jars of grain and oil and wool, and somewhere in those complexes scribes sat with damp clay and a stylus, recording what came in, what went out, and who was responsible. Their script is called Linear A. The signs are angular and simplified, written in rows. Whatever pictures they once resembled have long since smoothed into abstract strokes. Linear A appears on tablets, on small clay discs, on nodules tied to containers and doors. It is an administrative script, bound tightly to the economy of the palace. And we can read almost none of it. The irony is that its close neighbour and probable descendant gave up its secrets long ago. Around 3,500 years ago, on Crete and later on the Greek mainland, another script appears in the same kinds of settings. We call it Linear B. For decades, both scripts sat undeciphered side by side. The tablets looked related. The signs seemed similar. But no one knew what language either of them recorded. And then, in the early 1950s, that changed. An architect and amateur codebreaker named Michael Ventris, building on the meticulous groundwork of a scholar named Alice Kober, showed that Linear B was writing an early form of Greek. He got there by doing exactly what we wish we could do for every unknown script: counting, comparing, hunting for patterns across large numbers of tablets. The Linear B tablets are usually longer and more repetitive than the Linear A ones we have. They come from palace archives at Pylos and Knossos and Mycenae. They deal with sheep, wool, chariots, land holdings, lists of people. Certain words appear over and over in the same positions. Some tablets repeat the same clusters of signs with only one element changed, like items in a list. Ventris and Kober's methods teased out these regularities, proposed sound values for the signs, and tested whether the resulting words matched the names of places and gods known from later Greek. They did. Once a few place names clicked into focus, Knossos, Pylos, the rest followed. In a matter of a few years, Linear B moved from mysterious marks to legible, if limited, bureaucratic Greek, and Linear A sits right beside that triumph and refuses to cooperate. Because the two scripts are so clearly related, scholars tried the obvious move. Borrow the sound values of the Linear B signs, apply them to Linear A, and see what comes out. This gives us something like a pronunciation. We can sound out many Linear A words into strings of syllables. We can pick out sequences that behave like numbers, and fractions and commodities and personal names and places. We can see accounts laid out in columns, with totals at the bottom and headings at the top. In other words, we can often say how the documents are structured and roughly what kind of thing is being counted. But when we try to match this sounded out words to any known language, they do not land. If Linear A used the same sounds as Linear B, and if the language beneath it was simply an older form of Greek, we would expect to recognise at least a few core words, or the names of a few gods. That does not happen. The transcriptions do not look like Greek, or like any other securely known language of the Bronze Age world. And so most specialists conclude that Linear A is writing a different language entirely, one that has come to be called, cautiously, Minoan. Probably a language of the Aegean that came before Greek, one that never survived into any later written form. It may belong to no family we know. If it left any descendants, they left no clear trail. This is what makes Linear A so uniquely strange. It is not that we are staring at wholly opaque symbols, the way we are with the Indus seals. On the contrary, we know a fair amount about the signs. We can catalogue them, count their frequencies, chart their positions. We have partial sound values for many of them, thanks to their overlap with Linear B. We have a decent idea of which marks are numbers, which stand for commodities like grain and wine and oil, which likely mark units of land or livestock. We can even watch the script working inside a palace economy. A typical Linear A tablet might list a series of entries, a name, a commodity sign, a number, and then a total at the end. Sealed nodules show that officials were closing storerooms and containers under some system of control. The whole thing looks like an early form of double-entry bookkeeping, tailored to Bronze Age farming and craft. And yet, when we ask the simplest questions, the answers blur. What is the word for sheep here? Is that mark a title, a profession, or a family name? Which god is being named on this offering vessel? A few words seem to recur in religious contexts, on libation tables and ritual objects, and researchers have proposed links to later deities, but such proposals are fragile, and most remain speculation. Without a bilingual, without a longer text that clearly tells a story we could check against archaeology or later myth, every guess sits on uncertain ground. So Linear A occupies a narrow, maddening middle. It is not mute the way the Indus signs are. It tells us enough to rebuild an economy that weighed grain, allocated rations, tracked flocks, managed storage, and probably coordinated trade across the sea. It shows us a writing tradition that lasted for centuries and spread across an island. And it stops just short of telling us what that economy called itself, what words it used for rank and office, how it named its gods, how it spoke of its own island. In the script descended from it, used only a few generations later on the very same island, we can suddenly understand phrases like, so many sheep belonging to such and such a man, holder of this plot of land. Linear B lets us eavesdrop on a new set of rulers running the same machinery. Linear A shows us that the machinery was there first, humming away in another tongue, one that for now stays just beyond our reach. Now let us shift the map back east, and back in time, and look at what happened once cuneiform had grown up. Long before the Minoan palaces, scribes in southern Mesopotamia began using their mature script for something new. Not sheep, not jars of oil, not labour rosters, a list of kings. We call it the Sumerian king list. Dozens of copies survive, written across many centuries from different cities and different political moments. They do not all agree on the details, but they share the same basic shape. A sequence of lines, each giving a city, a ruler's name, and the length of his reign. On the surface, it looks like a bare-bones chronology, one dynasty after another, lining the past up in a single straight line. But the king list is not a modern history book. It is political theology, written in clay, in a landscape of rival cities, each with its own gods, its own traditions, its own elders who remembered things differently. A text like this does a very particular kind of work. It says that kingship itself is a divine institution, that it comes down from heaven, not from human councils or the accidents of war, that it moves, on purpose, from city to city. When one city rules, it is because the cosmic office of kingship has chosen to sit there for a while. And copying this list, updating it, inserting your own dynasty at the right point in the sequence was a way of saying, we are not upstarts, our power is legitimate. We stand in the same line as heroes and half-divine rulers, reaching back into the deep past. And then there are the numbers. In the earliest part of the list, the section that describes the age before a great flood, the reign lengths are not merely long, they're impossible, at least in any ordinary sense. A handful of kings, ruling in a handful of cities, with reigns that add up to well over 200,000 years. Individual rulers are said to have reigned for 28,800 years, for 36,000 years. One is given 43,200. Early scholars struggled with this. Were they even reading the numbers correctly? The Mesopotamian system was sexagesimal, built on sixties, so the units could be grouped in ways that felt strange. Some tried to shrink the figures down into human lifespans. But the pattern is too consistent across too many copies to be a simple mistake. And the very same text, further down, gives perfectly reasonable numbers, reigns of 24, 36, 40 years. For later kings we can check against independent inscriptions, so the enormous early numbers seem deliberate. Today, most specialists read these pre-flood figures as symbolic, schematic, ideological, rather than literal. Long reigns, expressed in neat multiples of 60, may be encoding ideas about cosmic order, about cycles of time, about the special status of an age before our own. They mark those first kings as different in kind from later rulers, closer to the gods, less bound by ordinary time. We see similar moves in other traditions. The Hebrew Bible gives its earliest patriarchs lifespans of many hundreds of years. Later traditions across the region speak of world ages, each ruled by different powers, separated by catastrophes. The Sumerian king list belongs to that family of ideas. It is simply the oldest such sequence we can read directly, in the script of the people who made it. What makes it especially eerie is that the pre-flood section is anchored in real places. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. These are not mythical realms. They are actual cities, whose mounds have yielded temples and pottery and ordinary administrative tablets, and many of the kings after the flood are people we can meet in other texts. One ruler of Kish, named Enmebarajesi, shows up on an independent inscription as a genuine historical figure. Later dynasties can be lined up, imperfectly but recognisably, with real layers of ruins. So the king list is not pure myth. But it is not pure archive either. It is something in between. A telescoped story that welds legendary figures, local traditions and real dynasties into one unbroken line. And running right through the middle of it is a single stark sentence. Then the flood swept over. That line cuts across the clay like a scar. Everything before it belongs to a different order of time, of impossible reigns and half-divine kings. Everything after it is the world we can, at least in part, check against bricks and graves and account tablets. The flood is the reset, the hinge of time. For many readers, ancient and modern alike, that structure is intoxicating. Named kings, named cities, a catastrophe that wipes the slate clean and a new beginning. It feels like a memory of a world before us, dimly recalled through ritual recitation, and it is easy to look at those enormous numbers and think, perhaps there really was a lost civilization, long before anything we know, whose records we have simply not found. A few modern writers push this much further. They take the king list at face value, treat the pre-flood reigns as literal history, and then ask, where are the ruins from 200,000 years ago? And if we do not find them, they say, it must be because the evidence was destroyed, or suppressed, or lies somewhere on the ocean floor. The real situation is both less dramatic and, in a different way, more interesting. Archaeology across Mesopotamia shows dense settlement beginning in the late Stone Age. growing gradually from small villages to irrigation, to temples to surplus, and finally to cities, all within the last several thousand years. There is simply no sign of an urban civilization in southern Iraq 100,000 or 200,000 years ago. The layers of soil, the dates, the whole record are quite clear on this. But floods were real. The great rivers did burst their banks. Certain sites show flood deposits in the early 3rd millennium that could easily have been remembered as the flood, the one that ended a world. And over generations, such an event can grow in the retelling, stretch backward in time and merge with older stories of a cosmic deluge. So the king list may preserve a layered memory, a real tradition of city kingship going back a few centuries, names of rulers we can sometimes confirm, an echo of genuine flooding that marked a break between eras for particular communities, and on top of all of that, an ideological frame that stretches those memories across a cosmic timeline and roots them in a divine story about kingship coming down from heaven, surviving the catastrophe, and continuing right up to the present dynasty. The world before us in the king list is not a hidden technological civilization. It is an older way of organizing memory, a world where time is thick with meaning, where numbers say more about holiness than about calendars, and where history begins, not when people start writing, but when someone decides to line the past up, king by king, and press it into clay. If kingship descends from heaven, then someone has to be up there to send it. And in the Mesopotamian texts, that someone is not a single-robed patriarch, and not a council of ancient engineers. It is a whole population of powers. Among them are the Anunnaki. And here we have to be careful, because this is a name that has travelled a very long way from what the clay actually says. In the oldest Sumerian sources, the word does not mean one specific god with a face and a biography. It is a collective term, a category. Often the Anunnaki are simply the great gods of the divine assembly, especially those tied to the underworld and to the fixing of destinies. In some hymns they sit in judgment. In some myths they gather at banquets. Lists of gods, written on clay at various cities, group them alongside other categories of divine beings. Different cities, different periods, different schools of scribes sort the labels a little differently. There is no single canon where the Anunnaki are always the same numbered group, doing the same job under the same leader. So when we read the word in translation, we are not looking at a proper name like Zeus. We are looking at something closer to the High Court, or the senior officials of the divine world. This matters enormously when we move from accounts to myths. On one side of the archive are the texts that built the first writing, the lists and tallies and receipts, whose language is stripped down and conventional. A line about bread for the Anunnaki in that world is not trying to be poetic. It is following a formula. But on the other side are the great compositions, the ones where the gods act and speak and scheme and complain. There the language is dense with metaphor and allusion and old traditional phrases. A single Sumerian verb can mean decide or cut or fix or engrave depending on where it sits. A word translated as create in one line might mean assign a role in another. That ambiguity is not a failure of translation. It is built into the poetry. The same writing system that once counted barley as being stretched to talk about the structure of reality itself. Modern readings that turn the Anunnaki into ancient astronauts lean almost entirely on those mythic passages, but they tend to treat them as if they were dry technical prose. They point to lines where the gods fashion humankind from clay, and give them the pickaxe and the basket, and impose the yoke of labour, and they say, this is a literal account of genetic engineering by overseers from another world. They were descended from heaven as the language of spacecraft, rather than the ancient idiom of divine authority. They take titles like overseer of the canals and treat them as job descriptions in some planetary mining operation. And the scholars who work through these texts tablet by tablet disagree at nearly every step. Where the popular books see technology, the specialists see familiar imagery of the ancient Near East. Clay is what humans and tablets and bricks are all made of, so of course it appears in stories about human origins. The pickaxe and the basket are shorthand for agricultural labour. The yoke is an image for obligation, in many languages. Descending from heaven was an idiom for divine power long before anyone dreamed of rockets. And the very same texts that supposedly describe a workforce engineered to mine gold also linger lovingly on rituals, and music, and the building of temples, and the etiquette of divine feasts, concerns that map cleanly onto a Bronze Age city and not at all onto a refinery among the stars. None of this proves, in some absolute sense, that there were never any visitors, or lost technologies, or forgotten ages of the world. It is always possible to imagine more layers than the ones we can see. But when we ask what the tablets themselves are actually doing, in their own script and their own grammar, the answer is theology and politics and cosmology and literature, not technical reports. And there is a genuine mystery here that needs no conspiracy at all. From the very beginning, humans reached beyond themselves. A system invented to track grain and goats was very quickly turned to writing the names of gods and offerings and hymns. King lists placed rulers in a cosmic sequence. Myths filled the sky and the deep with councils of beings who decided fates and sent floods and handed down kingship. Part of that is power. Saying the gods chose my dynasty is far more persuasive than saying we won the last war. And part of it is something deeper and very human. When the oldest records you have are broken, when the lists start in the middle and the numbers do not quite add up, it is natural to imagine a larger pattern just out of reach. A time before the flood, a council above the sky, elders who know. Our own stories about ancient astronauts are, in that sense, recognisably human too. Faced with broken evidence and unexplained gaps, we also populate the unseen with intelligences that look a little like ourselves, only scaled up and moved off-world. We simply rename the elders as engineers. The clay does not settle that question either way. It only shows us that, as far back as we can read, the urge to fill the silence above the text with a larger cosmic story was already there, waiting. If we want to know what the clay actually says, we have to talk about how people read clay now. Not the version from the movies, where a lone genius stares at a tablet until it suddenly clicks, but the slow, methodical way that real specialists work through an unknown script. The basic toolkit is surprisingly down to earth. It starts with sign lists. For any script, from the earliest Uruk tablets to Linear A, scholars first try to catalogue every distinct mark that appears. Each shape gets a number, a conventional name, and a set of examples of where it occurs. For cuneiform, those lists are immense, thousands of wedge clusters that began as pictures of heads and jars and stars and feet. For the proto-Elamite and Indus signs, the lists are shorter, but also far more uncertain. Are these two slightly different shapes really two separate signs, or just sloppy handwriting of one? Next comes paleography, the study of how those signs change across time and place. A tablet from 1 century does not write its signs exactly the way a tablet from 4 centuries later does. Corners round off, wedges tilt, strokes get dropped. By lining up hundreds or thousands of tablets, specialists can say, this form of the sign is earlier, this streamlined version is later. That lets them date tablets, trace the traditions of particular schools, and avoid a dangerous trap. The assumption that a sign in one millennium must mean what it clearly means in the next. Very often it does not. Then, whenever we are lucky enough to have them, there are bilingual texts, the same content written in 2 systems, one of them already known. This is what cracked Egyptian hieroglyphs, through the Rosetta Stone, and it is what unlocked the older Mesopotamian scripts, through great multilingual inscriptions carved on cliffs by later kings. These are gold. They let scholars match unknown signs to known words, confirm the sounds, and see how the ancient scribes themselves understood their own system. Names are another anchor. Personal names, place names, the names of gods. In a partly understood script, you hunt for recurring clusters that might spell a familiar name known from somewhere else. If a certain sequence appears only where you would expect a list of merchants, and its shape fits a known pattern of names, that is a clue you can build on. It is exactly how parts of Linear B and many cuneiform languages were pinned down, by chasing the names of famous cities and gods. And beneath all of this lies statistical patterning. How often does a sign occur? What does it sit next to? Do some signs only appear at the start of a line, like headings? Do some clusters repeat at regular intervals, like grammatical endings? With the Indus script, for instance, statistical studies strongly suggest a structured system, with certain signs preferring the front of a sequence and others the end. That looks like a real script. But the texts are too short and the language unknown, so the statistics give us structure without giving us a key. And it is worth being clear that even the word red hides 2 very different achievements. One level is simply sounding it out, being able to look at a sign and say, this has such and such a value, and spell a word out sign by sign. For many Mesopotamian tablets we can do this well. We know the syllables, the standard word signs, the silent markers that flag a god or a city. But the deeper level is understanding, knowing the grammar, the idioms, the shades of meaning. A Sumerian verb may carry a dozen possible senses. Endings stack. Prefixes fold whole phrases into a few sounds at the front of a word. When two modern translations of the same line disagree, it is often not because we cannot read the signs, but because we are arguing over whether the line says the gods fix the fates, or the gods engraved the measures, or the gods assign the offices. For a script like proto-Elamite, we're not even securely at the first level. We can spot the numerals, the commodity markers, the shape of an account, but we cannot reliably attach sounds or whole words. With the Indus signs and linear A, we hover somewhere in between. And in the last few decades, the tools have changed again, quietly and profoundly. Multispectral imaging lets scholars read tablets that had been written off as illegible. Different wavelengths of light bring out faint impressions and erased lines, and traces of ink hidden beneath later marks. A tablet that looked blank under an ordinary lamp can suddenly show a ghost of signs. Three-dimensional scanning captures the exact shape of every wedge and crack, which matters enormously, because cuneiform is a three-dimensional script, where the depth and the angle of a stroke can change its meaning. High-resolution digital models let specialists rotate a tablet on a screen, examine a damaged edge, and tell a shallow accidental scratch from a real stroke. Whole archives are being scanned this way and placed online. And then there are the great open databases, projects that put transcriptions, translations, photographs, and detailed information for tens of thousands of texts onto the internet, where anyone can search them. Instead of one scholar slowly turning over clay in a museum basement, many people around the world can query the same collection at once, hunt for every occurrence of a rare sign, or run a new statistical model across an entire genre. Machine learning is being brought in carefully to sort variant signs, to propose restorations of broken lines, to flag unusual patterns a human eye might slide past. All of this has sped the work up, but it has not made it fast. Decipherment still moves one small, argued, overstep at a time. A newly read sign here, a narrowed meaning there. The redating of a single tablet that shifts a whole sequence by a century. Proto-Elamite has resisted for more than 100 years. The Indus signs have been studied nearly as long, with no consensus in sight. Linear A has sat beside its fully deciphered cousin for over 50 years and still yields only fragments of certainty. Some of these scripts may stay in that in-between state for a very long time, described, counted, modelled, but not truly read. And yet, when we look at a broken tablet and say, we do not yet know what this line means, that is not a confession of defeat. It is a snapshot of a process, a record of exactly where we are in a conversation with the past that is still going on. And if one of these silent scripts finally does speak, if a bilingual surfaces in a forgotten storeroom, or a new method cracks a pattern we had never seen, that conversation could change in an instant. When the change comes, it probably will not look like a dramatic reveal. It might look like a footnote in a specialist journal. We propose revising the value of a certain sign in early proto-Elamite contexts. Quiet, technical, easy to skip past. But if that one sign appears on hundreds of tablets, if it sits in the middle of numbers and commodities, that single change can cascade. Grain deliveries become wool rations. The temple of one god becomes the storehouse of another. A city that seemed to be importing food turns out to have been exporting it. The direction of a whole trade network flips. This is how the big discoveries usually arrive in the world of ancient writing. Not as one key that opens everything at once, but as a slow turning of gears, where a single, small tooth finally catches. Imagine for a moment that a cluster of proto-Elamite signs, long assumed to be generic headings, is convincingly read as place names. Suddenly those early ledgers are no longer just 5 measures, 10 measures, 3 workers. They become maps. We might trace caravans moving up from the plain of Susa into the mountains or down toward the sea. We might see that what looked like local bookkeeping was woven into a much wider web of exchange. Or suppose a new sign value in linear A turns a list of goods into a list of people with titles. What used to be anonymous numbers become ranks in a hierarchy. overseers, scribes, temple staff. A palace that seemed modest could reveal itself as the centre of a dense administrative world. Even in Sumerian, where we can already read so much, the oldest tablets are still opaque in crucial ways. A clearer understanding of one recurring term in the earliest Uruk accounts might finally tell us whether the central institution was more like a temple, or a household, or an early office of state, or something we do not even have a modern word for. And that alone would reshape how we think writing began, as a tool of religion, of economy, of kingship, or of something in between. New readings could reach into daily life too. An Indus sign on a seal, if it were ever securely tied to a longer text, might turn a mute sequence into cattle overseer, or weaver's quarter, or simply a person's name. If several such readings lined up, those little seals from the great cities would stop being silent emblems and start naming occupations, and neighbourhoods, and perhaps clans. We would move from patterns of signs to glimpses of bakers, and metalworkers, and boatmen. And the phrase that has haunted this whole story, a world before us, would come into sharper focus, because it can mean several different things at once. Sometimes it means mythic time, an age of half-divine kings, where the numbers are symbolic and the geography is a dream. Sometimes it means ideological time, a golden age invented to justify the present. We rule now because our line reaches back to the first kings. And sometimes it points to a real, dimly remembered horizon, earlier cities, earlier floods, earlier movements of people that the clay records only in part. Future translations will not suddenly prove that some advanced lost civilization built everything and vanished, but they could show us that the early world was more connected, more mobile, more experimental than we ever guessed. Trade networks reaching further, seasonal journeys baked quietly into the records, beliefs and practices spreading along the same roads as copper and precious stone, then taking on new colours as they arrived in new valleys. And somewhere, in a storeroom right now, there may already be a tablet that holds one of these quiet revolutions. Maybe it is a small proto-Elamite account with an overlooked column of signs that turn out to be the names of months, anchoring the whole system to a calendar. Maybe it is a broken linear A tablet whose missing corner, if it were ever found, would repeat a phrase also preserved in linear B, and finally hand us a bilingual line. Maybe it is a dull little school exercise that glosses one archaic sign with a later, clearer word, and bridges a gap in meaning we have been guessing at for a century. We do not know yet which piece of clay will shift the story, or whether it has already been dug up and simply waits, in a drawer, for a new technique, a fresh pair of eyes, a different question. If you pull back now from all the details and simply listen to what this clay has been telling us, the first thing you hear is how ordinary the beginning really was. The oldest secure writing we have is not a lost gospel from a vanished super-civilization. It is wedges pressed into river mud, recording barley and sheep and beer and days of labour. It appears in cities we can find on a map, in a stretch of a few centuries a little more than 5,000 years ago. It grows out of older traditions of clay tokens and sealed clay balls. We can watch the administrative logic tightening, as pictures turn into stylized signs, as round impressions turn into ruled tablets. And yet, even here, in a genre we think we understand, there is so much we still cannot read. Thousands of the oldest tablets sit in museums with a catalogue number and a rough description, and line after line of signs whose exact values are still debated. Proto-Elamite tablets stare back at us with an inventory of symbols we can classify and count, but not translate. Indus seals show consistent patterns that look like a real script, but with inscriptions so short and so isolated that no one can follow them into a sentence. Linear tablets are clearly doing accounting and probably ritual, but the language behind the signs has no name. So we occupy an odd position, and it is worth holding it honestly. On one hand, the broad outlines are solid. Writing, as far as the evidence shows, begins in the late 4th millennium, in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, and perhaps a little later in the Indus Valley and on Crete. Its earliest sustained use is administrative, receipts, and inventories and allocations, tied to institutions that blend religion and economy and power. The grand myths and king lists come later, once the system is already well established as a tool of memory and control. On the other hand, the fine grain is still full of uncertainty. We can be fairly sure a column is counting jars of oil and still not know what the heading at the top calls the place. or how the people in the list are ranked, we can spot a sign that always sits at the end of an Indus sequence, and not know whether it is a title, a grammatical ending, or a family emblem. We can match linear signs to their descendants and sound them out, and still find the words themselves opaque, because the language is simply gone. To listen to the clay responsibly is to hold both of those truths at the same time. The tablets are real and datable and dug from known ground. Their basic function is not a mystery, and at the same time, a great deal of what they actually say, the names, the offices, the fine distinctions, the shades of meaning in the oldest divine titles, remains out of reach. That leaves a wide space for wonder, but not for anything at all. When later texts speak of ages before the flood, or kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, they are working within traditions we can partly trace. Priestly lineages, ritual calendars, real landscapes reshaped by real floods. It is tempting to fill the gaps with neat and dramatic answers, lost continents, vanished technologies, wiped clean by catastrophe. But the clay does not ask for that. It invites slower, better questions instead. What did these people think of as before? How did they use memory and exaggeration and myth to make their own present make sense? Wonder, not certainty, is the honest response. The oldest writing on Earth shows us a world both distant and strangely familiar. Temples that doubled as warehouses, officials counting grain on tablets instead of screens, communities tying their whole lives to the rhythm of the water and the seasons and the trade routes. And it shows us, just as clearly, the limits of what we can know from broken artifacts and half-read scripts. The fact that so much remains unread is not a failure. It is an honest boundary, and it is also a quiet promise that new work still matters, that the conversation is not over, that somewhere a small answer is already waiting. And that, I think, is the thought to carry down with you into sleep tonight. Not the dates, or the names of the scripts, or the shapes of the signs, just this, that somewhere out there, in a cool drawer in a museum basement, that small tablet of baked clay is still resting where we left it, still holding its marks, still keeping most of its meaning to itself. It was made by a person who woke to the same sun you will wake to, who felt the same weight of tiredness at the end of a long day, who pressed a few careful marks into wet mud and then set the tablet down, never once imagining that it would outlast their language, their city, their gods, and every empire that came after. And yet here it is, reaching across more than 5,000 years, from a hand we will never see, in a voice we can only half hear. There is no fear in that. There is only the deep, quiet strangeness of how long the human story really is, and how gently the past keeps its secrets, and how much of it is still, patiently, waiting for us. So let your breathing slow now, and let the day go. Let the tablets rest in their drawers, and the storerooms keep their silence, and the scholars sleep too, ready to begin again tomorrow, one wedge at a time. If any of this kept you company tonight, you can let the channel know with the smallest of gestures, a quiet tap of the like button, or a word in the comments telling me where in the world you drifted off, and what the hour was when you did. I love seeing the modern map that gathers around these very ancient places. And if you would like more of these slow walks through the deep past to find you on quiet nights like this, you might subscribe, so the next one comes to you when you need it. There is never any rush. These stories will keep here in the dark for whenever you come looking. For now, the clay keeps its own counsel. We press our questions to it, gently, one tablet at a time. And somewhere, in a storeroom, or a field not yet dug, the next small answer is already waiting. Rest easy tonight, wherever you are. Let the past keep its peace, and let the quiet carry you the rest of the way. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and good night. And